Az Yeronanu by Shlomo Katz from his album Likra Shabbos. How's everybody doing? Great to be with you on a Sunday night. Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. All right. Who is with us on a Sunday evening? James in Indianapolis, Melissa in Great Neck, Yosef in Massachusetts, Nancy in North Carolina, Bill in Mid-Missouri, John in Maine, Paul in the Great Northwest, Tom wishing everyone a good week from Pennsylvania, Stephen in New Hampshire, third class tonight, I'm on a roll. Caroline in Central Florida, Elise in Austin, Texas, Dawn in LA, Paula in Chicago. Paula says, almost makes me want to jump on a horse and ride. Doesn't he have kind of that Western twist to it? I love that song. Very good. And over there on the YouTube side, Aoife checking in from Florida. Welcome, everybody. Tonight is our daf is Tzadi Zayin, page 97 here in Tractate Yevamos. We're completing chapter 10 and opening chapter 11. If you're just joining us, we're on a 7.5-year journey. We started in January of 2020, and this is the 14th volume of the Talmud. And, there's other tractates that are probably a little bit easier and less discomfiting to begin with. So, if you're just starting out and joining us, I try to make every page of every tractate as accessible as possible. This material is particularly challenging. In this tractate, sometimes it's challenging because we have weird combinations of who married who when and keeping track of the maternal sisters and paternal half-brothers, etc. And other times it's difficult because, it's just difficult material, right? So levirate marriage is the basic topic, the obligation when a Jewish man dies without having had a child and leaves a widow and a brother. They have an obligation to marry, and their first child becomes an heir of the brother who died. Or they can opt not to marry, but they have to perform a ceremony called chalitza, which releases them so that they're free to go marry whoever else they want. Appertinent to these laws of levirate marriage, we've learned a lot about marriage, different types of marriage, different prohibitions within marriage, within sexual relations, extramarital relations. And tonight we're going to be touching on rape and seduction and other very difficult topics. So we just, put on our adult brains and just work through, always remembering that the Torah specified who can marry and who can't, what's a prohibited relationship. Maybe it was the first time in world history that specific laws, codified laws, banning incest and various types of incest came into the world. And so to understand what are all the potential ramifications of such laws, the sages examine many cases and many extreme cases and many extreme hypothetical cases that would never come up in real life, but they're working through what the law would be so that we really know what the law is. So it's not that this is because they want these things to happen or even could conceive of them happening in real life, but they still are going to work out what the law is to stretch our understanding and make sure we understand what the law is in every situation. All right, we picked this up at the end of chapter 10 on page 97a. We've been discussing the final Mishna, Mishna number 6 of chapter 10. which touched on the subject as the same as a few previous Mishnas about what happens when a minor male, performs sexual relations or even marries a woman. This is not permitted, but we're not examining criminal law here and consequences in that branch of law. What we're examining is what are the ramifications and consequences in the laws of inheritance and prohibited relationships. And so one comparison that's made at the end of that Mishnah is that a boy who's 9 years and 1 day old and who has sex either with just any woman or with his Yevama, right, where he's the brother of a man who died and left a widow, does that sexual act count as anything? If he's younger than that, it doesn't even count as sex. It's like nothing happened. But he's old enough that something happened, right? And so when people have sex that was prohibited, not just because they're a minor, but because there's a prohibited relationship there that has consequences on, that person's future partners, future inheritance, etc. And a comparison is made to this minor having sexual relations with a man who is an adult but is sexually underdeveloped, and so like the minor could never cause a pregnancy with his sexual partner. So the Gemara raises a contradiction from the following source. With regard, and we're sort of near the bottom of 97a, with regard to a man who's 20 years old, who has not developed 2 hairs in the pubic region, they must bring proof that he is 20 years old, and then he is established as a eunuch who may neither perform chalitza nor perform levirate marriage. Right? It makes sense that he couldn't perform yibum if this man was the surviving brother of the guy who died childless. So you can never marry your brother's wife or his widow if your brother dies. She is prohibited to you. The only exception where a brother could marry his brother's wife even after the brother died is because he died childless, and we're going to perform levirate marriage. But the purpose of levirate marriage is to create an heir, right, an inheritor for the brother who died without having had a child. And if this brother is sexually underdeveloped such that he could never impregnate the widow, then he's not going to perform yibum. He's disqualified from yibum. And because yibum is not an option, the other alternative mitzvah, chalitza, is also taken off the table. Likewise, in the case of a woman who is 20 years old and has not developed 2 hairs, they must bring proof that she is 20 years old and that she is an alonus. We've seen this term before, a sexually underdeveloped woman. She cannot get pregnant. She doesn't have the sexual capacity to get pregnant. And so with her, we perform neither chalitza nor yibum. And the Gemara says, wasn't it stated with regard to this baraisa comparing the 20-year-old underdeveloped male to the 9-year-old, that Rav Shmuel Bar Yitzchak said that Rav said, and this law applies only if he developed other signs of a eunuch by the age of 20. Right? What is a eunuch? I mean, it's the equivalent of a castrated male. Bill can probably tell us from history, more implications of that definition. But the idea here is one who, even as an adult, it's not a castrated male, although I think that's where in English eunuch is often referred to. But here it's other signs that he's just never going to be sexually developed and be able to father children. So the Mishnah, by contrast, is referring to one who merely showed the signs of maturity at a late age. There's some people who just don't become sexually mature to a late age. That's not a eunuch. He's eventually going to mature. The eunuch will never mature. Rav has said the language of the Bryce is also precise as it teaches, and he is the eunuch. One can learn from here that this is referring to one who is definitely a eunuch, not a potential eunuch. I just wanted to see. Okay. Now the Gemara asks a question with regard to the law itself. And in a case where this young man who is late to develop sexually, but he does not develop the signs of a eunuch, until what age is he considered a minor? He's going to develop sexually, but we're not going to treat him as an adult otherwise. Until what age do we call him a minor? And the school of Rabbi Chia taught until most of his years have passed, i.e. until he reaches the age of 35, or some say 40, Where do we get that? Because we have, I think it's Psalm 90, right? How many years are the years of a man's life? 70, unless he's granted special vigor, 80. Typical, lifespan, even though we all hope to reach 120. And so until he reaches 35 or 40, if he doesn't seem like a eunuch, but he's still sexually underdeveloped, we're just waiting for him to develop he's a minor with respect to marriage law. On the same issue, the Gemara relates, when they would come before Rava to inquire about someone who had reached the age of maturity but had not yet developed the physical signs, if the person in question was thin, so he would say to them, go and fatten him up before we decide on his status. And if he was fat, he would say to them, go and make him thin. As these signs, the hairs of maturity, sometimes they fall off due to thinness, and sometimes they fall off due to fatness. And it is therefore possible that after his bodily shape is adjusted through nutrition, he will develop the signs of maturity and he will not have the status of a eunuch. And that concludes chapter 10. Now we go into chapter 11. And I thought I would just read to you Rav Steinsaltz's brief introduction to the chapter. This chapter deals with anomalous family relationships. Its main objective is to inquire into the laws of levirate marriage that pertain to these relationships, as that is the central topic of the tractate. However, other halakhic issues pertaining to these relationships will be discussed as well. Aberrant family relationships can be caused in several ways. One such cause is nonmarital intercourse. For example, rape or seduction, right? You're not allowed under Jewish law to have sex with anyone other than your wife, right? That's a man not with anyone with his wife except his wife, and a woman not with anyone except her husband. But we know that the world is like this, that people end up having sex outside of marriage. And if they produce offspring, so sometimes that offspring is a mamzer. If it's a case of adultery, a married woman has sex with a man who's not her husband and who's Jewish, and then their child is a mamzer, and the child is, just laden with this terrible status. It's so difficult for him. But it can also happen if a woman is raped. Now, that's not her fault at all. She didn't. She was not guilty of adultery. And so that child is not going to be a mamzer, but there's other consequences of rape and of seduction. Now, because several sexual relationships are prohibited only if the man and woman are related through marriage, bizarre family relationships can be created when a man marries a woman with whom his father or son engaged in non-marital intercourse. The first Mishna is going to discuss, God forbid, you have a father who's a criminal and he raped a woman, right? And he raped her once and then, was sent to prison. And she was young, and the way he met her was actually because, she was the neighbor, and then, the man's son and that girl end up growing near each other, and they fell in love and they would like to get married. Now, can he marry a girl that his father raped? It's a complex question. Another possible cause of such relationships is conversion. The principle that a convert to Judaism is considered reborn and not related to his former close family members, even when they are twins, is to be considered when we look at levirate marriage and other issues. And this chapter will also discuss the status of a child whose mother converted while she was pregnant with him. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 11, Mishnah number 1. We're still on the A side of page 97. One may marry a relative, for example, the sister or the mother of the woman that he raped, and of the woman that he seduced. Now, nothing in what I just said should be construed as permitting rape. Rape is a death penalty offense. But, it's possible that the death penalty was not, could not be applied in that situation. It's possible that 20 years later, this person made an atonement that was accepted by the woman. We also saw that under Torah law, there's that case that we've talked about where a man rapes a woman and they can't apply the death penalty, but a penalty that he does have to live up to is that if she wants, he has to marry her, and he can never divorce her, and he has to support her financially for the rest of her life. That's also not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is that, for example, you cannot marry a woman and her sister. Well, what if you didn't marry this woman, but you had sex with her, and then later you want to marry her sister? Or your father raped a woman, and later you want to marry her? This is the kinds of questions that are being examined here. Challenging, difficult emotional material, but we're going to work our way through it. So, however, one who rapes and one who seduces a relative of the woman who is married to him, he is liable to receive capital punishment or charis for engaging in prohibited sexual intercourse, depending on the particular family relationship. A man may marry a woman raped by his father, or a woman seduced by his father, or a woman raped by his son, or a woman seduced by his son. Rabbi Yehuda prohibits marriage in the case of a woman raped by his father, or a woman seduced by his father, because of the Torah prohibition, you shall not uncover the robe of your father, which on one level means you can't marry your father's ex-wife or widow. And at another level, according to Rabbi Yehuda, means you can't marry a woman that your father had any kind of relations with. But that's a minority opinion. Now, the Gemara. We learned in the Mishna that which the sages teach in a baraisa. If a man raped a woman, he is permitted to marry her daughter. Again, we're not talking about criminal consequences. That's a different area of the law. So if a man raped a woman, he is permitted to marry her daughter. If he married a woman, it is prohibited for him to marry her daughter. So that's a distinction that's being made, right? If you married a woman, you could never marry her daughter or her mother or her granddaughter, nothing like that. But if it wasn't marriage, if you had sexual relations with her that did not lead to marriage, then her relatives remain technically permitted. So if he married a woman, it is prohibited for him to marry her daughter. However, the Gemara raises a contradiction from another baraisa. One who is alleged to have engaged in intercourse with a particular woman is prohibited from marriage with her mother and with her daughter and with her sister. Now, this seems to contradict what we just read. So apparently, as a consequence of non-marital intercourse, there is a prohibition against the man marrying that woman's relatives. And the Gemara answers, this is merely prohibited by rabbinic decree, lest the man continue to engage in intercourse with this particular woman after marrying one of her relatives, thereby transgressing a Torah prohibition. And once again, we need to be careful to distinguish laws that are doraisa from laws that are derabanan, right? So from written scripture, written in the Torah versus laws that are by rabbinic decree, which form a fence around the Torah. It's just as prohibited. Sometimes the penalties are stronger for violating a rabbinic decree, but we have to keep in mind what the source of the prohibition is. Now, the Gemara asks, and anywhere that there is a rabbinic prohibition, does the Mishna teach that one may marry the woman ab initio? Since the marriage is prohibited by rabbinic decree, the Mishna should have taught that if he marries her, he is exempt from punishment. And the Gemara answers, when we learned in the Mishnah that he may marry her ab initio, it was dealing with their marriage after the death of the woman that he raped or seduced. The rabbinic prohibition does not relate to this case, as concern with regard to forbidden relatives ceases when the one who makes them relative, the one that they're related to is dead, right? You can't marry your wife's relatives, but if your wife dies, then you can marry her relatives. Although with a bunch of limitations we've already touched on in past lectures. The Gemara asks, with regard to the Mishnah's ruling, from where are these matters derived? How do we know this law? It is, as the sages taught, with regard to all other prohibited sexual relations, lying is stated like lying with someone, whereas here, with regard to a man's intercourse with his wife's relative, a different verb is used, not lying with her, but taking her. And this is to tell you that the Torah prohibited intercourse with these relatives only through taking, i.e., the man's acquisition of his wife through marriage. It did not prohibit intercourse with the relative of a woman with whom he engaged in non-marital relations. Rav Papa said to Abaye, however, if that interpretation is so, then with regard to intercourse with one's sister, concerning whom it is written, and if a man takes his sister, his father's daughter, or his mother's daughter, you must, which is prohibited, right? You cannot have incest with your sister, whether paternal or maternal. You must also say that it is only intercourse through taking, i.e. marriage, that is prohibited. But intercourse through lying, i.e. without marriage, is permitted? How can this be? Right? If we're going to say that lying with a person is just talking about non-marital intercourse and taking means marital intercourse, since the prohibition on being with your sister uses the word lying, you shall not lie with your sister, are we to understand that you can lie with her? I'm sorry. I think it says taking. So are we to understand that it means you cannot marry your sister, but you could lie with her? And Rava said the halacha that if a man raped a woman, it is permitted for him to marry her daughter is derived from here. It is stated, the nakedness of your son, meaning we have to look to a different verse than the one prohibiting your sister to understand what's going on here. And it is stated, Leviticus 18:10, the nakedness of your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, even their nakedness, you may not uncover, right? A man cannot lie with his granddaughter. So it may be inferred from here that the daughter of the woman's own son from a different relationship and the daughter of her own daughter may be uncovered, i.e. intercourse with them is not prohibited. In other words, if a man married a woman who already had a child, and then his wife died, could he end up marrying the daughter or the granddaughter of, his wife that died, through children that are not his own. Obviously, you can't marry your own granddaughter. Are we going to say that you could marry the granddaughter, your step granddaughter, as it were? Yeah, the answer is no, but according to this proof, maybe. And it is also written, you may not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter. You may not take her son's daughter and her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are near kinswomen. It is lewdness. Other times it is an abomination. How so? How can the two verses be reconciled? Evidently, the former verse is stated with regard to rape. A man may marry the daughter or granddaughter of the woman he raped, provided they are not his own offspring, and the latter verse is stated with regard to marriage. Marrying the relatives of one's wife is prohibited. Right? They're not in any way okaying rape, but what they're saying is that a rape can produce a child which is not the offspring of a marriage, and marriage seems to be involved when it comes to creating certain prohibitions. The Gemara asks, perhaps I should reverse the resolution of the contradiction between the verses and state that the daughter or granddaughter of his rape victim is forbidden, whereas the relatives of his wife are permitted. And the Gemara answers, with regard to those with whom intercourse is forbidden, the concept of kinship is stated. See Leviticus 18:13 and 17. In marriage, there's kinship. You create a relative. Whereas in the case of rape, you don't create a relative. Therefore, the prohibition against intercourse with a woman and her daughter or granddaughter is clearly referring to the daughter and granddaughter of one's wife and not his rape victim. It is taught in the Mishna that Rabbi Yehuda prohibits marrying a woman raped by his father or a woman seduced by his father. And Rav Giddel said that Rav said, what is the reasoning for the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda? It is, as it is written, a man may not take his father's wife and may not uncover his father's robe. Meaning that one may not uncover the robe that his father has seen. And from where is it apparent that this verse is written with regard to a woman raped by his father and not with regard to his father's wife? It is as it is written just before that verse with regard to rape, and the man who lay with her shall give the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver. And how do the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda respond to this proof? If the prohibition stated had been juxtaposed with the verse dealing with rape, it would be as you said. However, now that it is not juxtaposed with it, as there is another prohibition in between, namely a man may not take his father's wife, the prohibition of he may not uncover his father's robe is necessary to teach that which Rav Anan taught. As Rav Anan said, that Shmuel said, the verse is speaking of a widow waiting for her brother-in-law, who is this man's father, to perform yibum. And what is the meaning of the phrase, his father's robe? The robe that is potentially his father's, he may not uncover. Now the Gemara questions this interpretation. Why does the Torah need to explicitly prohibit intercourse with the Yevama of one's father, right? So your uncle died, left a widow. He never had a child. So your father is the Yavam of your aunt, who is the widow. Okay, so now that widow, because she is not just your aunt, but she's also your father's Yevama, that's an additional relationship that's going to make her prohibited to you. And the Gemara answers, the Torah purposely rendered this act a more serious offense by specifying that it is prohibited for one to engage in sexual relations with his father's Yevama. One who engaged in intercourse with her has violated not one but two prohibitions. The Torah specifically prohibited his father's Yevama in order to have one who engages in relations with her violate two prohibitions. The prohibition against relations with his aunt and the prohibition against relations with his father's Yevama, thereby rendering it a more serious offense. And the Gemara asks, but why not derive that one violates two prohibitions? Because there's also a prohibition against the Yavama engaging in intercourse with a member of the public, a man who is not her Yavam. And the Gemara answers, the Torah prohibited one's father's Yavama so that those who engage in intercourse with her will have violated three prohibitions. Intercourse with his aunt, intercourse with someone's Yavama, and intercourse with his father's Yavama. And if you wish, say instead that the verse prohibits the father's Yavama is referring to the period after the death of his father, who has no additional brothers, so there is no prohibition against the Yavama engaging in intercourse with someone outside the family. Now we go to 97b, and because we're on this subject of non-marital non-marital sexual relations creating sort of odd, challenging, even crazy relationships and figure out what the legal implications of them are, the Gemara is actually, going to go into, that song, I'm My Own Grandpa. It sounds funny, I know, but it really is so. It's going to go into 7 riddles of absolutely insane situations involving incest and other craziness, just to ascertain who's related to who. And it's all prohibited, except for one, but what exactly is the prohibition that is being violated? So the opinion that a man may marry a woman raped or seduced by his father can lead to the existence of unusual family relationships. For example, a woman says, I have a half-brother from my father and not from my mother, and my half-brother is the husband of my mother, and I am the daughter of his wife. What does this mean? Rami Bar Chama said, this state of affairs is not legitimate according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishna, who holds that a man may not marry a woman with whom his father engaged in intercourse, even if they were not married. However, according to the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, a woman whose father was not married to her mother can legitimately have a paternal half-brother who is married to her mother. Now the Gemara cites a second riddle about a bizarre family relationship. A woman says, he is my brother and he is my son. I am the sister of this one whom I carry on my shoulders. What is the solution? You find it in the case of a non-Jew who engaged in intercourse with his daughter, and she bore him a son who is therefore both her brother and her son. The movie Chinatown comes to mind. And the Gemara is referring to a non-Jew because it does not wish to entertain the idea that a Jew would act in such a manner. Obviously, this is a very ethnocentric text. The Gemara cites another riddle. Peace upon you, my son. I am the daughter of your sister. You find the solution in the case of a non-Jew who engaged in intercourse with the daughter of his daughter, who bore him a son. And this son's mother is related to him from her mother's side as well, as she is his sister's daughter. Another riddle. Water drawers who draw water in buckets to irrigate fields, let this cryptic riddle fall among you. This boy whom I carry is my son, and I am the daughter of his brother. What is this? You find the solution in the case of a non-Jew who engaged in intercourse with the daughter of his son, another guy with his granddaughter, as their son is also her uncle. Yet another riddle. Woe, woe for my brother who is my father and who is my husband and who is the son of my husband and who is the husband of my mother, and I am the daughter of his wife, and he does not provide bread for his brothers who are orphans, the sons of me, his daughter. How? You find the solution in the case of a non-Jew who engaged in intercourse with his mother, and she bore him a daughter. This daughter is both his sister and his daughter, and he engaged in intercourse with that daughter. And then the old man, his father, engaged in intercourse with her, and she bore him sons. This woman is therefore the wife of her brother, and he is also the son of her husband, the old man, and her father's brothers, i.e. the sons she had with the old man, are his daughter's sons. The Gemara cites another riddle. You and I are siblings. Your father and I are siblings. Your mother and I are siblings. You find the solution in the case of a non-Jew who engaged in intercourse with his mother, and she bore him 2 daughters, and he then engaged in intercourse with one of them, and she bore him a son, and the sister of the son's mother calls him and says this statement to him, as she is his sister from his father's side and his father's sister from their mother's side, and she is the mother's sister from both sides. The final riddle to make you cringe. You and I are cousins. Your father and I are cousins. Your mother and I are cousins. You find the solution to this riddle in a permitted manner as well. For example, Reuben, who has 2 daughters, and his brother Shimon came and married one of them, the son of Levi, and the third brother came and married the other one of them. And the son of Shimon says this statement to the grandson of Levi. They are cousins from their mother's side. Shimon's son and Levi's son are cousins from their father's side, and Shimon's son and the mother of Levi's grandson are cousins from their father's sides. And thank God we're done with the discussion of Mishnah number 1. Mishnah number 2, far more interesting. With regard to a female convert, right? So a woman who converts to Judaism, whose sons converted with her, they do not perform chalitza for each other's wives, right? If one of them dies childless and leaves a wife, then you would think, well, then why wouldn't his brother perform yibum or chalitza with the widow? But the fact that they're converts changes the situation, because remember, when somebody converts to Judaism, they become somebody, their new Hebrew name, Ben Avraham Visara. They're considered the children of Abraham and Sarah, not the children of their non-Jewish parents. And therefore their previous relationships are severed, right? It's like they're born anew. And so they do not perform chalitza for each other's wives, and they do not perform yibum with them, as their conversions are considered a rebirth, and therefore they are unrelated, even though they were born as brothers. And this is so even if the conception of the first son was not in the sanctity of Israel, i.e. the mother had not yet converted when she conceived of him, but his birth was in the sanctity of Israel, that his mother converted while she was pregnant. And so when he was born, he was already a Jew because his mother was a Jew, whereas the second son was both conceived and born in sanctity. The first son is considered a convert who is unrelated to his brother. And this halacha, this law, similarly applies to a maidservant, a female slave, whose sons were freed with her, as they too are not considered relatives. One who emerges from slavery is like a newborn, just like a convert is like a newborn. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara. The sons of Yudan, the maidservant, this female slave, were freed. Rav Acha bar Yaakov allowed them to marry each other's wives after divorce. Right? In slavery, they were married. They were freed. They divorced. They actually married people they didn't want to marry. It was something their masters forced on them. But once they came out of slavery, they actually developed a longing for, what was previously his brother's wife. But since they're reborn, this was permitted because they're not marrying his brother's former wife, right? You can never marry your brother's wife unless it's a yibum situation, and this isn't. But after this divorce, it's possible because they're reborn after they're freed from slavery. Rava said to him, presumably to Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who permitted these marriages, didn't Rav Sheshes prohibit marriage in that case? And Rav Acha bar Yaakov said to Rava, yes, Rav Sheshes prohibited it, and I permit it. I disagree with Rav Sheshes. And the Gemara explains, if the two freed slaves or converts are half-brothers from their father's side and not from their mother's side, everyone agrees that the marriage is permitted, as even a Gentile and certainly a convert are considered unrelated to their father's family. If they are half-brothers from their mother and not from their father, everyone agrees that it is prohibited, right? Because they're considered to be children of their mother, since everyone knows who the mother is. When they disagree, it is a case when they are brothers both from their father and from their mother. The one who permits the marriage claims that we trace them after their father. Their paternal lineage is followed since they are called the sons of so-and-so, their father. Since they are recognized by their paternal lineage, it is well known that they are considered unrelated, and there is no concern that people will infer that a man may marry his sister-in-law, and they would understand that these guys may be Jewish now, but they were not born Jews, and the only reason they're able to marry the sister is because they were considered newborns at the time of their conversion or their mother's conversion. And Rav Sheshes maintains that they are called the sons of so-and-so, their mother. Therefore, this concern does exist, as it is not common knowledge that a convert is considered reborn and related to his mother's family, and people might come to think that, well, those two brothers, were married to two women, and then they both couples divorced, and then they, exchange wives, as it were, which would normally be prohibited. We thought it was prohibited, but they did it. It must be that it's permitted. No, it's only permitted in this unique circumstance because they are converts. And some say a different version of this dispute. Rav Acha bar Yaakov disagrees with Rav Sheshes, even with regard to maternal half-brothers. And what is the reasoning behind this opinion? The legal status of a convert who just converted is like that of a child just born, and all his previous family relationships are disregarded, whether from his father's side or from his mother's side. And we learn in the Mishna, with regard to a female convert whose sons converted with her, they do not perform chalitza with each other's wives, and they do not perform levirate marriage with them. What is the reason that they may not perform yibum? Is it not because they are prohibited from marrying them, contrary to Rav Acha bar Yaakov's opinion? And the Gemara answers, no, the Mishnah means that these wives are not included in the law of chalitza and yibum, as they are considered unrelated. They're not even brothers of each other, so why would you include yibum or chalitza? And each wife is therefore permitted to marry anyone, and they too are permitted to marry her because they're not brothers. There's no yibum obligation because they're not brothers, and there's no prohibition on marrying your brother's sister because they're not brothers. They're considered not brothers. And the Gemara asks, but doesn't the Mishnah teach that this is so even if the mother converted while pregnant with the first son and the second son converted independently? So granted, if you say that they are prohibited from marrying each other's wives, this explanation is consistent with that which is taught. Which, when it was taught, even so they are prohibited from marriage. Although the first son was not conceived as a Jew, and only his birth was to his mother as a Jew, whereas the second was both conceived and born as a Jew, and therefore they are like the sons of two different mothers. Even so, they are prohibited from performing levirate marriage with their sisters-in-law. But if you say they are permitted to marry each other's wives, what is the meaning of the word even in this law? And the Gemara answers, the Mishnah means that although both of them were born in sanctity, and people might come to confuse them with Jews from birth who may not marry their sisters-in-law, nevertheless they are permitted to marry each other's wives. I'm almost done, so if you have any comments or questions, get them in. And there are those who say a different version of this inference. So too it is reasonable that they are permitted to marry their sisters-in-law, as the Mishnah teaches, even if the mother converted while pregnant. So granted, if you say that they are permitted, this explanation is consistent with that which is taught. Even so, they are permitted. Although both of them were born in sanctity and people might come to confuse them with Jews from birth, nevertheless, they are permitted. But if you say that they are prohibited, what is the meaning of the word even in this law? And the Gemara answers, the Mishnah means that although the first son was not conceived in sanctity and only his birth was in sanctity, whereas the second was both conceived and born in sanctity, so that they were all like the sons of two mothers, nevertheless, they are prohibited from marrying each other's wives. Where did this law come out? They are prohibited to marry each other's wives, even though they are considered to be reborn, that they are not each other's brothers. And so, okay, there's no yibum situation, but neither is there a prohibition against marrying your brother's wife after they divorce or he dies. Nevertheless, it's prohibited. Why? By rabbinic decree, as a fence around the Torah, because it could confuse other people and lead them to think, oh, I guess you can marry your brother's wife. And the answer is, no, you can't. And they decreed in this situation, even though by Torah law it would be allowed, by rabbinic decree, it is not. All right, let's go to questions or comments on Yevamos 97. Going back a few nights ago, if a man rapes a woman and she nevertheless marries him but refuses to sleep with him, and then he dies childless and he has a brother, is the brother required to at least offer to be her yavam, or must they perform chalitza? You know, that's a great question, right? So, like, perfect Talmudic question. If the man had a wife and he died childless and he left a brother, seemingly that's a yibum situation. Are we going to say that because that marriage arose from a rape where the court forced him to marry her when she chose to take that option, and you know, she never wanted to sleep with him, but he couldn't divorce her and he had to sustain her, since he was never going to have a child by her, does yibum now apply, even the possibility of yibum, with the surviving brother? Or perhaps if yibum doesn't apply, and then even chalitza doesn't apply? Perfect Talmudic question. I don't know the answer. Maybe we'll run into it in the coming pages. Sharon, I don't remember if this was addressed, but if a yavam, the surviving brother, agrees to yibum, levirate marriage, is the yavama, the widow, obligated to marry that brother? Can she decline? Yes, she can decline. That's why chalitza is always an option, not just for him, but for her. They both have to be willing to marry for the yibum to happen. Sharon, other than these riddles, although I think we saw early in the tractate that terrible outcome where, you know, she can decline and then they have to perform chalitza. But if he rapes her, it's like a yibum was created. I think at that point, if she wants out, they'll let her out and he has to give her a bill of divorce. But sex in that situation, even though it was rape, created a marriage which has to be broken, and she has the option to break it, but she gets a bill of divorce, and if she had any interest in marrying a priest, she would not be able to, because of that bill of divorce. That's how I think I remember it that way. It was early in the tractate. Sharon, other than these riddles, some of these relationships are in evidence in the Bible. Rachel and Leah, Reuben, I think, and the concubine of Jacob, David's son raping his half-sister. Are these relationships intended to serve as lessons to us? I mean, I think a lot of these are just sort of stretching the mind to track the relationships and these weird situations that arise from non-marital intercourse. But in terms of sort of the content of the relationships, I think that the lesson is a strong negative lesson. Do not do this, right? It is, you know, they're sort of being playful in examining these crazy relationships, but there is definitely a tone of disgust with it. And that's why they would ascribe that anything like this would happen, could only happen to a non-Jew. We would never imagine that a Jew, one of the, of a nation of priests, could ever engage in such repulsive behavior. In the same way that we've seen elsewhere in the Talmud, when Jews engage in repulsive behavior, euphemistically they're referred to as the enemies of the Jews, right? And so maybe it's that same kind of negative lesson here. Elvis, Can you name any other ancient civilization or people whose law went to such great lengths to outline and define the boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable carnal situations and the relations that could and did result from them? I'm not an expert, but I don't know of other examples besides the Torah. I'm not an expert, and I certainly don't know of any other examples outside the Torah. I think it was absolutely revolutionary to say that, not only does might not make right, and that law does not simply come from the scepter of a king who says what's what, but that there's a law higher than kings which binds kings and priests and high priests, and everybody is bound to this law that comes from a higher source. And this law is not only about murder and theft and property, but even about, relationships. And, elsewhere we'll find in the Talmud that there's the obligations of a husband to his wife, right? And a husband has to provide sex to his wife. Like, a wife is not obligated to provide sex to her husband, although if she refuses, for too long, then that will break up the marriage, because the purpose of the marriage is so that he can fulfill the mitzvah of having children. But we don't really talk about the obligations of a woman toward her husband. We do very much talk about the obligations of a husband to his wife, even carnally, that depending on his profession, right, and sort of how available and how much energy he has, dictates how many, literally, what frequency a man must provide his wife with sexual relations if she so desires. That kind of thing, that did not exist anywhere else in the ancient world, to my knowledge. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Reminder, no class tomorrow, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We resume class on Thursday. Nina and I are having a little getaway for our 20th anniversary. So keep reading, and we'll do a highlights show of these 4 pages when we catch up on Thursday. So we'll do pages, God willing, 98, 99, 100, and 101 on Thursday. Have a great evening and a great beginning of your week. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers.